With the 2022 election cycle in sight, Republicans are working to change state voting laws. A new CBS News article titled "Republicans Unite on Election Integrity: Message for Coming Elections" looks at how the Republican Party is strategizing on how to win future elections by shrinking voter turnout. With us now is CBS News Washington reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin, in February, the Republican Party launched a committee on election integrity. What can you tell us about this message by the GOP?
Good morning. Well, after parties lose elections, they typically embark on kind of a soul-searching exercise. And a lot of times that involves, talking to strategists and pollsters and figuring out how to win back voters they lost. That's really not the case happening right now. In the Republican Party, after losing the Senate and the presidency, instead they're focused on this message of, quote, election integrity, focusing on action underway in state legislatures across the country in about 40 states that are aimed at restricting voting access and curbing voting laws. They're also focused at a national level on pushing items like voter ID and pushing this message. And what's remarkable that we found in our reporting is that we talked to a variety of different people from a variety of different groups within the Republican Party, and they all seem to be on board with this message. And this is significant considering the action that we're seeing in the state legislatures. But what we're finding is there's a real energy among the Republican Party base in opposition to what's known as H.R. 1 or S1, this big voting rights bill that passed the House earlier this month and is now in the Senate. We've talked to activists among all factions of the Republican Party, and they say this is a key animating issue for Republicans.
Caitlin, you can remind me, because this is your beat, but I feel like the last time the Republican Party had this kind of deep dive look at where the party is going, the conclusion was that it had to become a big tent party. It had to create policies that would be attractive to people outside of their traditional base. Now it seems like, as you point out, the base is really interested in this, that they're doubling down on their base and not looking to expand. And I'm wondering if this is sort of more of marketing. Calling it voter integrity is just sort of a good slogan, but really what they're talking about is limiting the number of people who can vote who they believe won't be voting for them.
That's exactly right. This is all about the messaging. And when you talk to people in the Republican Party who are supportive of these measures, they're trying to argue on policy grounds. But when you look at the action in the states, efforts to limit who can vote and how you can vote really contrasts with the message of integrity. But you're right to note that, in 2012, Republicans did this so-called autopsy where they tried to figure out how to expand the Republican Party, but they found that it didn't work in 2016, and they didn't need it to work because then President Trump was successful in that regard. So now they're focusing on these issues. And this comes as we've seen an intense effort underway by Democrats to combat a lot of these proposed changes. Changes in states that, I might add, include states that President Trump won. Iowa just signed measures into law earlier this month. Iowa is a state that the former president won overwhelmingly. And of course, we're seeing a lot of action underway in Georgia as well.
It's such an interesting question that Anne-Marie poses, I guess, Caitlin, which is, and I'll add to that question. So does it mean, is it your understanding in speaking to some of these elections officials, some of these Republicans, that they're abandoning the notion of a big tent party? In other words, if they're digging in or leaning into their base, while understanding that they may be alienating others who, let's face it, they could bring into the party if the message was a sound one, if the message was solid or more appealing, let's say, than the message from the Democrats, then they wouldn't have to resort to some of these restrictions, which some people believe is voter suppression, right? The message would be enough to have people vote them into office, as opposed to just leaning into their base. My question is, are they abandoning that notion of adding people into the Republican Party who historically have not been members of the Republican Party?
You know, I had a really interesting conversation a few weeks ago with the lieutenant governor of Georgia. He's a Republican, and he has been trying to get his party to focus on Republicanism 2.0, which includes a broader tent and trying to win back voters that they lost, and also appealing to them in a bigger way. But, you know, he seems to be kind of in the minority there, considering what we're seeing across the country. Republicans will also note that they believe that they did expand support, particularly among Latino voters. But what's really happening here, and especially at the state level, is that state lawmakers that we've spoken to say that they're hearing from their constituents over and over again that they believe that what happened in the 2020 election was fraudulent. Of course, there has been no evidence of that. In fact, the evidence has been to the contrary, that this was the most secure election, according to intelligence officials. But still, this is kind of the animating force among the Republican Party base at this point. And it's significant to note that, you know, it's hard to argue that none of this would be happening without former President Trump's involvement in this and pushing this false narrative of a stolen election. So that's resonating with the base. But you do have people in the Republican Party that are trying to argue on policy grounds in opposition to H.R. 1, calling it a federal takeover of state elections. So you're seeing a party united around this message of election integrity, which allows them to kind of cover all of those bases.
Well, you know, what some call election integrity, others are calling a resurgence of the Jim Crow era. There's a big focus on Georgia, obviously. You know, the Republicans lost Georgia, and they, you know, there was a lot of complaints about it, but there was a recount after recount after recount, I think 3, and the conclusion was the counts were accurate, the election was secure. When people talk about the Jim Crow era coming back, is that a fair comparison? You know, often we talk, Vlad and I talk here about people just don't know the history, so they might not know what that means when you say Jim Crow era in regards to voting rights. But what do you make of that comparison?
Well, Georgia's a good example of this, right? This is a place that had record turnout, a state that touted that record turnout, and a state that Biden won for the first time for Democrats in a long, long time. And then we quickly saw a reaction in the Republican-led state legislature to reform voting laws. And there were proposals to reform voting laws that had been on the books for years and years and years. For example, there had been a push in the state legislature to eliminate no excuse absentee voting that allowed people to vote by mail or vote absentee without an excuse. That had been in place since 2005, a very popular program that helped elect Republicans over the years. But after the election, you saw this push to try to eliminate it. Now, it's important to note that as we're getting into the weeds of this, that is not likely to be part of what's passed eventually. But there was also a push to limit Sunday voting, which, of course, as we know, has been a key driving force for black voters, particularly within the churches that organize voters to go to the polls on Sundays. There was an effort underway in Georgia to limit Sunday voting, and that specifically targeted black voters in the state who really made history in 2020 for their turnout. That is also not likely to make it into the final version. But in the final version, you're still likely to see some limits to drop boxes, still likely to see some limits to early voting deadlines and also or absentee deadlines, and also there's an effort to push for voter ID for absentee ballots. But this is something that we're watching across the country, and in a lot of these states, it is a reaction to 2020. And you see some Republicans kind of saying the quiet part out loud in some of these states, saying that they believe the election was stolen, that they believe they need to make these changes to turn out Republicans again. So that's kind of what is happening across the country. But it's also important to kind of focus on what actually gets passed. And that's what we'll be watching in Georgia, which we're expecting legislation to potentially go through this week.
All right, Caitlin Huey-Burns, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can read Caitlin's full article right now. All you have to do is head to cbsnews.com.